All right, so today we're looking at the Varia VS3 coffee grinder. Now, this is a really interesting coffee grinder for me, and it does have a little bit of a specter, let's call it, hanging over it. It is also a great tasting grinder. So let's talk about this. Number one, if you're new to the world of coffee grinders, this is what's called a single dosing stepless conical coffee grinder. I know that's a lot of words, but basically what it means is you're gonna put one serving of coffee in here at a time. There's several advantages to that: freshness, mixing and matching your brew methods, all that kind of thing. Stepless, meaning there's no like clicks in between each setting, so you can kind of set it between settings. And conical, meaning it uses these cone-shaped burrs as opposed to flat burrs, which are very often found in more expensive grinders. Also, and this is really cool, you can get several different burr upgrades for this grinder, you know, with different finishes on it. That is a nice plus, gives some fun experimentation, and is really unusual for a grinder with conical burrs. As far as workflow goes, they are very simple. It's got a power switch right here. It's got all these like magnetic little accents up here that kind of snap on. The whole body is metal too. And really all you do is set your grind setting, turn it on, put your beans in the top, and your ground coffee gets spat out in the cup. This cup is a little smaller than 58 millimeters, meaning it'll fit inside a normal 58 millimeter portafilter, but also will fit in Breville portafilters, which is nice. It comes in white and black. Obviously I have the white model here. And overall it's very intuitive and easy to use. And as far as single dosing grinders go, I feel like the styling on this one is really good, especially considering the price. Now let's talk about those burrs for a sec inside that are actually doing the legwork of grinding your coffee. Varia advertises these as 48 millimeter burrs, which technically they are. This is a bit of a gripe I have with coffee grinder conical burrs, is they measure them from the outside of the outer burr casing, which is not really a functional measurement. The actual functional size of the burr, I usually measure the diameter of the inner burr to get this, is closer to 30 mil. Don't think anybody's trying to be deceptive there. That's just the industry standard way of measuring these things. When I was grinding for filter, I was grinding around 10 or 11 on the wheel here, and I was getting pretty good clarity on those filter cups. A little bit of body, good sweetness, but nothing that I would call like heavy astringency or bitterness coming through, anything like that. So pretty happy with it on the filter end. Espresso, I think we should make espresso. Varia recommends using something called RDT with this grinder, which is a little spritz of water. And that's something that, number one, it keeps retention down. So any grinds that are retained in there, we'll talk about that shortly, keeps that kind of minimized. But more importantly, from my perspective, like static can be a bit of an issue with this grinder. As far as grind setting on espresso, I was grinding around, 3 to 4, which is a little bit coarser than they recommend. One thing that you'll notice very quickly is that this cap is included for a reason. Popcorning definitely is an issue, which is beans kind of popping out of the grind chamber as it's finishing up that grinding dose. So that takes about 30 seconds to grind a shot of espresso. The grinds are nice and fluffy, no clumps. Let's pull this. All right, so that pulled great, just under 30 seconds. Let's give it a taste. And that is a really good shot of espresso. So I'm getting lots of good flavor separation here with all the different tasting notes in the coffee, but very, I would almost say like a very rich cup. Not heavy, but very full in like a very flattering way, exactly as you would hope for espresso. And this was very interesting because Sarah and I taste tested on espresso against even some more expensive grinders than this one, and very often we were gravitating towards these cups, which is saying a lot because we test a lot of different grinders. So that's a very encouraging result, especially considering that it can also grind filter coffee. So at this point, you're kind of starting to wonder, like, what is the catch here? And I think there is a potential catch, but I wanted to run it through all of my tests first. This is something that I do with every grinder. I put it through a lot of tests as I'm working on reviewing them, and this one is no exception. First thing I always measure is sound. And This is one of the more quiet grinders that I've tested actually. It came in right around 70 decibels. A lot of them tend to come in closer to 80 dB. So as far as sound goes, you know, I wouldn't say I want to listen to this grinder all day, but it is a quieter grinder as far as grinders go. Now, as far as retention, grinds retained inside the grinder after you're done grinding, I was a little leery of this one. They include bellows with the grinder, which is not usually a good sign for retention. This is something that you can stick on here and kind of use to push extra air through to clear out any leftover grinds. It's also got this like finger stopper in here that I never really used. As long as I used RDT, I didn't really need to rely on the bellows too much. After a huge seasoning run, which is basically putting a bunch of coffee through there to simulate extended use and kind of settle the burrs down from their as new state, it only retained about 0.5 grams of coffee grounds in there, which is pretty good. I cleaned it out, ran another couple doses through, and on filter, I was getting around flat in out, which is great. What I would put in is pretty much exactly what I would get out. On espresso, I was finding if I didn't use RDT, I would get, you know, 0.2 to 0.3 grams retained in there, which is a little bit more than I would hope for. With using RDT, that would go down to a flat in out, which that can trick you a little bit because there is also something in coffee grinders called exchange, where basically a little bit from your last batch comes out in your next batch. And even if it is a flat in out, like 18 grams in, 18 grams out, sometimes there's a little bit of carryover there. That's called exchange. In my experience, that was between 0.2 and 0.3 grams of coffee, which is kind of reasonable. But as far as retention goes, I'm gonna say I was pleasantly surprised. Seasoning and stress testing. And we're gonna come back to this at the end because there is some potential flags here. I always season grinders, as I mentioned. And as far as continuous use cycles, Varia recommends 60 seconds on at the most and 90 seconds off. Well, I wanted to push the grinder a little bit harder than that, so I usually season with between 2 and 3 kilos of coffee. I did that basically in one continuous run without giving the grinder any breaks, and it was okay. Following that, I will often try and grind up green coffee, unroasted coffee, which is extremely hard and extremely difficult to grind. I wouldn't recommend you do this to your home grinder because you can ruin a grinder this way. I left this test until last, and while it wouldn't grind the green coffee more than 1 or 2 beans, it would stall. It also didn't break the grinder. So that's good. As far as timings go, about 20 seconds to grind a 16 gram pour overdose and about 30 seconds to grind an 18 gram espresso dose. And as far as fidelity for espresso, you know, I was grinding around 3.5 there. Every tick I found would change the shot time for the coffees I was testing with around 5 seconds. And you could do like a half tick. So reasonable fidelity as far as dialing in espresso goes. So we're getting some good rungs on the board for this grinder so far. Let's talk about cleaning. And this was the first time I ran into some things with this grinder that I didn't totally love. As far as disassembly goes, it's pretty easy to disassemble. You just take the lid off and you keep turning this until it pops off. And the burr assembly comes out pretty easily. Now, the first thing here that I didn't really like is it's got this bearing up here that sits on top of this burr. I get why it's there. It makes the adjustment mechanism easier to turn, but I noticed after some extended use, this really caked up with coffee stuff. And especially with espresso grinds, they're so fine. I just have to think that over time, those coffee grounds are gonna work their way into this bearing and mess it up and eventually seize it. Also, this is a very small point, but this upper burr will only fit in here 2 out of 4 orientations. And that's because these little pins are not symmetrical. They're kind of only symmetrical one way. Not a huge deal though. I do like how it's a tool-free assembly until you get to this part right here where you actually need to take out this lower burr. And this is where I really need to give Varia some credit here. They give you specific tools to be able to take this apart properly. And this is something that not everybody does, especially at this price point. And I really like that they did this here. So you can use this tool, pull this off, you can pull the lower burr out, and then you can pull the sweep arms out. And overall, even though I wish it was a tool-free assembly entirely, it is pretty easy to clean. They also give you like extra springs, extra pins, anything that you might lose during the cleaning process. They give you an extra set in this little bag. Big ups on that, I like that. One thing that I really did not like about the cleaning though is, and I noticed this when I was seasoning the grinder, is this beautiful white finish. If you get a lot of coffee grounds on it, it starts to go a little bit brown. This is only really a problem with the white one too, but if you like things to stay really pristine, you're gonna be wiping down this grinder a lot. Particularly right here around the catch cup, this really seems to be a magnet for coffee grounds to slowly accumulate over time. So you can clean it, it just really shows the dirt. This matte finish I think attracts it a little bit more. Also, these little indents here with the Varia logo, it's nice, but again, once coffee gets in there, it's really hard to get it out. One other thing I wanted to mention is when you are in here and you have the bearings and the sweep arm out, there is a little divot around the axle, and you're gonna wanna make sure that you blow that out really well. You don't wanna put that back together with coffee grounds still in there, because that's gonna muck up your system over time. So just something to watch when you're cleaning this. Still though, not a lot negative, especially at this price. And when you compare it to its competitors, and even comparing it to competitors is kind of tricky at its price point. You have the Baratza Encore ESP and the Fellow Opus. Both don't have the fit and finish quality of this grinder. This is a more substantial grinder. It also costs about $100 more, so 50% more. If you go online, you can see a lot of people comparing this grinder to the Lagome Mini, which has been replaced with the Casa, which I have also reviewed on this channel. Some people even say they kind of ripped off Option O with the Mini's design. I don't really buy that, because in terms of overall design principles, both of those are very similar to the Niche Zero, which is another competitor. This grinder is a lot cheaper than the Casa, and when I was A/B'ing them, I really found that the Casa shone on light roasts. Like, that grinder is really good on light roasts. If you're not really into light roasts, you may prefer this grinder over the Casa. And the Casa is almost $200 more expensive than this grinder as well, so that's a big price jump. You have the DF54. That's a flat burr grinder, but not the most standard size. This feels like a more cohesive package to me overall. You have the Niche Zero, which in my opinion, this does a better job on filter coffee especially, but it's a lot more expensive. And then you have the MHW 3 Bomber Sniper grinder, which this one came out first, and it does kind of seem like it could be ripped off from this one, and it's very similar, but at $100 more. So we have a lot of good things going on here. We have fantastic tasting espresso, good filter coffee as well. You have low price, simple workflow, included tools. I like all of this. Good looks. You have some bad. It can be pretty staticky, especially if you're not using RDT on this grinder. You have these bellows. If you really want to get super anal about your retention, I just think these things are so ugly. You have the dirt showing on the white model. You have popcorning. And one thing that I haven't mentioned that I find really annoying, especially for putting it on your counter, is this grinder uses an external power supply. I feel like from a design perspective, this is kind of cheating. This is a more annoying solution, especially when you're trying to cable manage on your counter. But overall, it kind of seems like this is a bit of a Goldilocks grinder. At its price, I see why people gravitate towards it. It looks great. You can find a lot of people online who love these grinders, and that's one of the reasons why it's become so popular in the last couple of years. But there is potentially a pretty big problem with it. And I'm gonna suggest that you go and look this up for yourself. Go onto Google, go onto Reddit, put VS3 dead in the search bar, and you will find a lot of stories of people with these grinders and they've died. Either the motor has died or the drivetrain has gotten stripped and they don't work. And even in Varia's manual, they tell you be very careful when you're using light roasted coffees because it can damage the grinder. You know, light roasts, they can be hard on a grinder. And that's why I did those stress tests on this grinder, because I said, I'm gonna see if I can actually break this grinder. And I couldn't, which is good, but those reports are out there and Varia has been receptive. They've listened to some of these criticisms and they've made updates to this grinder, but still, when it comes to this grinder, I'm going to say that you're going to assume a little bit of risk that at some point it could break. They offer a 1-year warranty. Lots of these grinders have broken after 1 year. You see people complaining about their customer service. I haven't been on the other end of those conversations, so I don't know what that has been like on both ends. That is probably my biggest caution with this grinder. Tastes great. It's great to use. Apparently, it's more robust than it used to be, but because I haven't used this for like a year, or longer, I really want to be clear in putting that disclaimer out there. So I want to hear what you think. We have a solid, well-rounded grinder with a potential Achilles heel. Is that a deal breaker for you? I would love to know. As always, I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you next time.